folic acid. So they inhibit that pathway. There are two drugs that work together. One's called trimethoprim, the other one's called sulfamethoxazole. You know them as Bactrim or Septrim. They typically are used for urinary tract infections because they're relatively mild and easy to tolerate, but we found out that they work very well against MRSA, particularly the community-acquired type of MRSA. Hospital MRSA is a big, you need a big one of you would get one here from, I'm not implicating the fitness center, but typically those are areas where you might acquire something like that. And that was the place where you scraped you fell on something, you're working out on a mat, you had a brush burn that got that kind of infection, which is considerably can happen, despite everybody's best efforts. Typically that's what they would prescribe to you unless you were allergic to it. And like anything else, there can be allergies to it. The big players we see with resistance a lot, MRSA, which is harbored in your nose, is methicillin-resistant staphylococcus aureus. And in your GI tract, before even C. diff reared its ugly head, they used a lot of vancomycin for gastrointestinal infections. Because it works in the stomach, it's not absorbed particularly well from the GI tract, but it works okay in it. So you got a thing called VRE. It's in the PowerPoint sequence and in the textbook. It stands for vancomycin-resistant enterococcus. Enterococcus fecalis, which is kind of in the strep family, is a royal pain in the neck to find antibiotics. And because when people have diarrhea, it gets on their wounds, it's really ugly. I mean, I've had people with staph E. coli and enterococcus all on the same wound in a big old sort of bed sore. And it's like, you're just in trouble. Things go down the bone, it's a mess, you can't. Let's see. Drugs of choice. For C. diff, we use a very interesting drug that sort of overlaps both, because it's used as an antibiotic and an antiprotozoan. It's called metronidazole. You'll hear about it a lot. It's called Flagyl, F-L-A-G-Y-L. It works on bacteria and protozoans because they're certain strains of bacteria and most protozoans are anaerobic in nature. They don't do well with oxygen. It's hard to find antibiotics for anaerobic infections. Flagyl has been around a long time. It's pretty well understood, other than a pretty bad headache for some people. That's about the extent of the side effect. It doesn't taste good. And it's very useful for protozoan infections, which we see a lot of with contaminated water. And you'll see when we get to the urinary tract, there's a couple of urinary tract problems, one of which is a sexually transmitted disease, which is a protozoan called Trichomonas vaginalis. Let's see. Antivirals. The one best category are the aciclovirs. That's Valtrex, that's the family name, plus aciclovir, valaciclovir is Valtrex. They are what are known as nucleoside analogs, what I'm fond of calling look-alike drugs. So we take something that looks like one of the nucleoside bases, A's, T's, G's, C's, U's, put a chemical substitution on them that's nasty, and when the virus basically swallows them up, because viruses, all they do is replicate. They end up they basically ingest a poison if viruses were alive, which they're not. But you basically are inducing a poison into the replication cycle, so the viruses can't form properly. That's an important antiviral. Other antivirals that are noteworthy. For influenza, the two that we use the most are Tamiflu and Relenza. They are neuraminidase inhibitors. They work, even though the virus forms, if it can't leave the cell, it doesn't hurt you. So that impedes them exiting the cell, being sort of spit out of the cell. The limitation, you have to take them early on in the course of treatment. Most antibiotics, 10 to 14 days. By that time, your immune system will kick in enough to cover you. Tuberculosis, an exception. Active tuberculosis, 9 to 12 months. Even exposure to tuberculosis, 9 to 12 question, if you have active tuberculosis, at least 2 antibiotics that you rotate every couple of months versus just one, and over that 9 to 12 month period, if you just had exposure and you're doing more prevention. Let's see. And now we're heading back into how they spread it. Most of these microorganisms, the way they spread has to do with a lot of properties. First, we have to define them. Things that are pathogenic are what we call true parasites. They occupy us, whether inside or outside, on the skin, on a liner, in the GI tract, but they hurt us. It's not like the good bacteria in your gut that help you digest. That's a mutualism, or what they call commensalism. We're both helping. They got a place to live, and they're helping us digest. It's a good thing. Okay? They live rent-free. Joking. Thank you for not laughing. But true parasites, okay, are what we call pathogens. Those are, because that implication is they may do damage. You have a variety of barriers to infection. They are all of the above. They are mechanical or physical barriers, chemical barriers, and biological barriers. Biologically, you're covered in microorganisms. It prevents the other ones from latching on. Chemically, you have salty, acidic chemicals on your skin, on your linings, and a variety of antibiotic and germicidal substances. And physically, those barriers are pretty sturdy. The skin's waterproof and tight, difficult to get through. The lining cells are stratified, so you have multiple layers. So, I mean, it's a good thing in that regard. Normal flora is the term that we use because we think they're all plants, but the normal bacteria you see all the time. Okay, it doesn't mean they can't harm you. They're bacteria. In a compromised host, and someone with a failed immune system, someone who's HIV positive, going to AIDS, somebody who has some immunological disease, you pick a reason, diabetic, somebody getting older, whose health is failing. Any normal organism can cause infection. Signs and symptoms. What's the difference between a sign and a symptom? A sign is something that's observable or measurable. Okay? If someone is bleeding, clearly that's a sign. If you can see a fever, if you can see swelling in your eyes, visible or measurable. If someone tells you, I got a headache, I'm nauseous, boy, I feel rotten today, it's a different story entirely. That's a symptom. Think of symptoms as being subjective, or their description. Signs are something that you can see, observe, measure, test. You have primary and secondary infections. Primary infections have done some kind of damage, skin, lining, border, lungs, and weakened you in some way to allow another infection to take hold. HIV positive, immune systems fail, they're more likely to get tuberculosis or reactivated herpes infection that results in Kaposi sarcoma. The fact that someone smokes forever and gets pneumonia, the pneumonia might be secondary to their chronic obstructive pulmonary disease or emphysema, but it's not a secondary infection in this context. So in the context of when we're talking about infectious disease, primary infection is the first infection, secondary is afterwards. I mean, what we're talking about for the final, the skin and respiratory, most of the problems with viral infections, secondary bacterial infections. Fungal infection of the skin, secondary bacterial infection. Primary, secondary. And again, the nastier it is, the more rapidly, the lower the infectious dose, the harder it is to treat, the more difficult to find antibiotic. Those are measures of virulence. So that's a generic term, not just for viruses. That can be bacteria, that can be any kind of protozoans, loins. That is a measure of virulence. I should certainly just be familiar because you need to know it with regard to latent and recurrent infection. A latent infection is something that's there, goes away, it's just sitting there doing nothing, and then you potentially can recur. Whether it's a standard, and most herpes infections can do that. HPV can certainly do that. We were worry about different things in the bloodstream. You and I, we go to get our teeth cleaned, we're going to have a transient bacteremia. Not a big deal, it's going to go away. You can make an argument that most of us have it after we eat something, that there's probably a measurable increase in some bacteria in the bloodstream. The things that are bad are things that should, like viruses in the bloodstream, would be bad. That's viremia. The worst one of these is called septicemia. And the implication is you have microorganisms in the bloodstream, plus their byproducts or their activities are creating a potential life-threatening situation. So septicemia is the worst of these complications. But there's a variety of those. An infection that disseminates means it's spread all over the place. An infection that's localized means it's localized to one area. When something is localized and begins to spread out of control, the implication would be that there's a significant problem. Remember what I said in lecture just the other day, we started talking about syphilis. It's the organism that really does not fulfill Koch's postulates. Because we can't, Koch he was the lab geek. I got to be able to grow it in the lab to prove that it caused the disease. Because I can infect another animal and watch it get sick, and I can take the fluid out of that and inject it in culture and then inject that in another animal. Syphilis, you can't do that. Not because it would cause the disease, because you can't grow it in culture. That's the problem. The syphilis is caused by, and it was in the PowerPoint for the urinary tract, it's called Treponema pallidum. Believe it or not, CCAC has a departmental final with 125 questions. They asked that same question no less than 4 times. Same question 4 times. I threaten my students if they get that wrong, that I will do them bodily harm, which I am not permitted to do, obviously. However, if you're a science major here, my boss allows me to strike students. I mean, I can get fired on my own, but he said I could. Anybody want to transfer and be a bio major? No fun. What stops most of your infections? That's right, your skin. Keep it intact. Let's see what else. Toxins, again, know some of the categories. The strongest toxins we know, botulism and tetanus, are neurotoxins. They spread through your nervous system very quickly. So be familiar with those. Very strong toxins. Toxins are generally what we call AB toxins. Diphtheria, pertussis, and a variety of other common toxic agents that are produced by bacteria. And the A is the active part. That's what does the damage. The B is the binding component. They come together, but the B component binds to the cell, that's its target, allows the A component to be swallowed, and then the A is released. So they work together. The B doesn't really do you any harm directly, but it facilitates the absorption. And we research B toxins, because that could be significant. In immunology, you might have heard, or in the immune system, if you studied it, in A&P, you might have heard about something called superantigens. The linchpin for your immune system is the helper T cell. Many students in this room would be aware of that today, or should have. The helper T cell bolsters your innate system and your adaptive system. That's the good news. It produces something called interleukin-2, which is very powerful. That's what does most of the work. That activates B cells and T cells. However, superantigen causes about 20% of all helper T cells to go crazy. And they secrete so many chemicals, they are destructive in nature. And you're going to see when we talk about wounds, which we'll probably get to the very last couple of things to talk about. Toxic shock syndrome, which you might have heard about, is caused by that. Scarlet fever, which came from the respiratory, is caused by that. Okay, the flesh-eating bacteria is caused by that. Those are superantigens. Most of the damage is by the immune system.